Welcome to the Quillette podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Kay, a senior editor at Quillette. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to Quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events. Welcome to the Quillette podcast. A year ago, renowned Harvard psychology professor Steven Pinker published Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. The book was lauded by the New York Times as, quote, lucidly written, timely, rich in data, and eloquent in its championing of a rational humanism that, it turns out, is really quite cool. Now, a year later, Pinker has written an essay for Colette in which he examines and confronts the many reactions that his book elicited. He also spoke to me by phone from his office at Harvard. Here are excerpts from that interview. Were you prepared for the scope of the response that was generated by Enlightenment Now over the last year?
I knew that it would be controversial. I had not anticipated a number of the responses. I didn't think there would be quibbling over who deserves to be counted as part of the Enlightenment, and that there'd be an objection to the very idea of endorsing Enlightenment ideals on the grounds that there are a bunch of different guys during the Enlightenment era who disagreed with each other. Therefore, you can't say anything about what the Enlightenment ideals were because those guys didn't all say the same thing. I had taken it for granted that the term Enlightenment ideals or Enlightenment project referred to a set of ideas of reason, science, promoting human welfare, finding a basis for politics and morality and meaning that did not hinge on religion. The fact that if you went back and you looked at what everyone wrote at that time, some people disagreed with others, therefore you can't say anything about the Enlightenment project. It didn't occur to me that people get hung up on that, which they did. Some did.
It strikes me that there are some figures you discuss, both in your book and also in this article that you've written for Quillette about the response to the book, that do have a genuinely ambiguous relationship with the Enlightenment. And one of them is Rousseau, who you quote one writer as calling him, if I remember correctly, the cuckoo bird in the Enlightenment cabinet. Did you have to wrestle with how you were going to include certain figures in the book?
I didn't. I excluded Rousseau, not because I was interested in gerrymandering the definition of Enlightenment, but just because my goal was to defend reason, science, and humanism. Each one of them those topics got a big chapter. I used Enlightenment as a rubric for those, together with progress. And yeah, I didn't count Rousseau. And to those who would say, well, aren't you committing the no true Scotsman fallacy, that is saying on the basis of the actual ideas that I'm not going to count him as part of the Enlightenment? Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was doing, because I don't care about the word Enlightenment. I care about reason, science, humanism, and progress. If you don't like the word Enlightenment, then we'll use another word. We'll call it secular humanism. We'll call it cosmopolitan liberalism. We'll call it the open society. I don't really care about the term Enlightenment because, other than that, it conveyed the idea more economically than any of the alternatives. But it's not as if it was a cult or a creed or a club with an official doctrine. It's a term that has a understood meaning, and that's the sense in which I was using it. There is no technical definition, and I considered it a waste of time, really, to quibble over who really gets to count as part of the Enlightenment. It's not like the Nicene Creed in Christianity, where there's a set of tenets that you have to believe in if you're a true Christian. That's just not what the Enlightenment was.
That said, people love to argue about who were the five greatest Roman emperors or the greatest the greatest scientists.
Yes.
Did you not predict that there was going to be some sensitivity about the way you would treat certain thinkers?
I didn't think that would be as big a deal as it turned out to be. Perhaps because I understood and said that, look, this isn't a creed, it isn't a club, it isn't a period of time with opening and closing ceremonies. It's a fuzzy concept, as most concepts are, but it has a well-understood meaning that when Barack Obama refers to the ideals of the Enlightenment, he didn't particularly care about, well, are people going to misunderstand him as referring to Rousseau? He had a meaning in mind. He anticipated that his audience would understand it in a particular way. I think they did. And that's the same way in which I used it. I was totally aware that, not every one of the philosophes and Lumière who wrote in the second half of the 18th century all agreed with each other. They weren't promoting a single doctrine that I was referring to, but there is a clustering. There are common threads across the writings of many of them. Rousseau would be an outlier in this space of ideas and concepts. I'm not embarrassed about the fact that I would exclude Rousseau. I don't think this is a fallacy because it's not the term enlightenment that I care about in the first place. It's the ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress.
In the piece that you wrote for Quillette, which is now on our site, you do engage quite closely with someone who is sort of like an anti-enlightenment figure in the form of Nietzsche. Could you describe the feedback you got on your treatment of Nietzsche? Because
yes.
It sounds like it evoked a strangely powerful response among many readers.
Yeah, I'm always surprised at what parts of my book get the biggest rise out of readers. And my somewhat irreverent treatment of Friedrich Nietzsche was certainly one of them for this book. I mentioned him in the chapter on humanism, largely because you can only understand a concept when you know what it is not. And that's just a good way of explaining what you mean. And there's a danger in endorsing humanism, that is, the moral system that prioritizes human well-being as the ultimate good. And a natural response would be, well, why do you even have to give that a name? Isn't that obvious? Doesn't everyone believe that? And the answer is no, not everyone believes it. Aside from the fact that, of course, we have several thousand years of a tradition that says that morality comes from Scripture or from God's dictates, there is a secular non-humanist philosophy, namely that of Nietzsche, which is that feats of heroic greatness are what matter, and the well-being of men, women, and children is dispensable. It's just a justification of slaves out of power to try to look after their own interests, but that we should forget about overall human welfare, about worldwide longevity and infant mortality and prosperity. That's not what morality consists of. It consists of Beethoven and Napoleon and great geniuses achieving works of immortal value. So that's not humanism. And you might say, well, why even distinguish it? Who could really prioritize works of heroic greatness over the health and happiness of individual humans? And the answer is, well, not only people who've had a pretty big impact in history, like the fascists, like the Nazis, like the Bolsheviks, but a surprising number of intellectuals and artists think that, as the 1960s bumper sticker put it, Nietzsche is peachy. And so does humanism need a defense? Yeah, it does need a defense. Not everyone agrees that human welfare is the ultimate good.
I realize I've been mispronouncing Nietzsche's name, but I'm going to continue for the sake.
Well, we can get it to rhyme with peachy if we pronounce it with a long e at the end, even if it isn't the German pronunciation.
I'm going to pretend that I anticipated that bumper sticker to justify my mispronunciation. But
excellent.
Now that we're talking about this, was one of your challenges in writing this book, and maybe it's evident in the way people have responded to it, that health and happiness are boring compared to heroism, to the Übermensch. Is there something that you're going against the grain by trying to convince people in the reality of human progress using numbers when people really are geared to enjoy stories about human heroism and to aspire to it themselves?
Yes, and I think we have to distinguish them. Certainly, it's more engaging and entertaining and thrilling to read a biography of Napoleon or to watch a film about a conquering hero than to see a bunch of data on how infant mortality rates have gone down. On the other hand, you can get people to think about things in different ways in terms of when they make the leap from great stories to what they care about in real life. And if you remind them that when a child dies, that's a real child. It's someone's child. Imagine it was your child. And to have people distinguish great fiction, great mythology from what they really want in real life is something that I think people can be convinced to do. And in fact, I even think we've seen that over the course of recent history. That before World War I, you had a lot of statespeople and intellectuals and poets gushing about how wonderful war is. It brings forth heroism and manliness, and it's holy and it's spiritual. And they were, contrary to our sensibilities, many people at the time said that there could be nothing more immoral than peace, because peace was decadent and people would become selfish and lazy and effeminate. They'd live in bovine content, as someone at the time put it. Well, until World War I happened. And then you just saw the massive carnage, a generation of young men wiped out. And people started to have second thoughts that maybe this image, the stereotype of the hero courageously meeting death. Well, when it comes to your 18-year-old son getting machine gunned to bits for no discernible purpose, well, maybe you should rethink whether hero stories are our best guide to how we should live our lives. So there can be a shift, even though I agree with you. Certainly, hero story. There is a part of us that responds to the image of the hero, but we can rethink what that actually means in people's lives.
In your piece that you wrote for Quillette, and certainly in your book, you use a lot of graphs. And I think at one point you mentioned there were 75 graphs in your book. Could you comment a little bit on how effective that sort of thing is in communicating the sheer magnitude of the improvements in people's lives?
Well, I've long been partial to graphs. Part of it is my own research in visual cognition, that I think that we are primates. A third of our brain is devoted to vision. And if you can appreciate something by looking at a line, it can be more compelling than a bunch of words. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to have those graphs. Partly as in my own autobiography, I was astonished when I saw the first graphs of what I now consider a big story of human progress, when I saw that rates of homicide had plummeted since the Middle Ages in Europe. So contemporary Englishman has about a 35th the chance of being murdered compared to his medieval ancestors. And I first saw that in a graph where the cluster of dots just swooped downward, and it just it jumped off the page. I thought, wow, I never realized that.
There was one critique of your book. I don't remember the exact title of the New York Times article, but the gist of it was Steven Pinker is so obsessed with numbers, he forgets the value of a single human life. The critique was basically that you're a sort of bureaucrat of progress who is letting the real pain that individuals suffer from all sorts of things escape you. What can you say to something like that?
That surprised me, and there is a common intuition among scientists and effective altruists and data-oriented people that many of our intellectuals and pundits and journalists and commentators are innumerate. Okay, just can't think in numbers. And I didn't want to say that because it seemed so insulting, but kind of our worst suspicions about journalists were kind of confirmed by this review, which raked me for celebrating the billions of people who have escaped extreme poverty and saying, well, yeah, but what about that? What does that mean to the coal miner who lost his job in West Virginia? Now, obviously we should care about everyone, including the coal miner who lost his job in West Virginia. But numbers are, I argue, the morally enlightened way of appreciating the human condition, because they treat all lives as equal. They don't privilege the pretty ones, the most photogenic or the members of our own tribe. Even if there was a trade-off where there were several tens of thousands of American workers who were displaced, but a billion people don't see their children die, don't starve to death, don't choke on cooking smoke, can afford to send their kids to school, we've got to say, if we're adopting policies that a billion people with a huge change in their lives are genuinely more important than a few tens of thousands of people have to find a new job. Now, that isn't callous towards those people, but life involves trade-offs, policies involve trade-offs, and we really should care about a billion people as opposed to 10,000 people. And moreover, people who are living or dying as opposed to people who are having to find new jobs. So numbers matter. And I was surprised to find that someone could get outraged by a view of the world that was based in numbers.
Could it be said that criticisms such as that constitute a misdirected form of objection to moral utilitarianism? The idea, we're all familiar with, for instance, I believe it's called the trolley problem, where you can sacrifice one identifiable person, but you can save many others whose names we don't know. Many people do find something monstrous in strict utilitarian calculus when it comes to human lives. Is there some element of that in the objection that people throw at you when you give them numbers, and yet, as journalists, they might be more familiar with names?
I think that's right. And in fact, my colleague Joshua Green has done many studies on the psychology of utilitarian versus more deontological intuitions, including studying people's brain activity when they're reasoning through the trolley problem of whether it's okay to flip a switch that sends a trolley on a track that would kill 5 workers as opposed to killing one if it stayed on its current trajectory. Noting everyone's a utilitarian in that scenario, the paradox being that if it involves something a little more premeditated, like throwing a fat man over a bridge to block the trolley, saving 5 men, then people's intuitions flip and they become deontologists. I agree with you. I do think that is an intuition that's very strong. And I discuss in the humanism chapter whether humanism is just utilitarianism and if that's indeed an indictment of humanism. And I think there is a difference between our intuitions in dealing with our everyday life scenarios and what we ought to do when we're thinking in terms of policy, or thinking in terms of what should governments do, what should we do when we make charitable donations, what should we do when we want to benefit people. There are the intuitions that grow up in terms of our day-to-day interactions with our friends and family just can't be extrapolated. They aren't the basis of policies that affect millions of people. And in the case of global development, it's not as if we're deliberately harming a certain number of people to benefit others in a kind of intuition that triggers the revulsion to utilitarian thinking, like grabbing someone with your bare hands and throwing them over a bridge. So it's not even as if that kind of revulsion enters into these decisions. And of course, we don't want to be callous to anyone, so it's not really a license to be indifferent to the plight of people who still are suffering. But we do have to think about policies in terms of how many people they affect and how they're affected.
Your book, Enlightenment Now, was published a year ago, and I'm guessing that you finished up the final edits on it in 2017, just as Donald Trump was taking control of the White House. How much did the Donald Trump phenomenon and the associated populist phenomenon in other countries, how much did that shape your last efforts at writing the book?
It did shape it. The Trumpocalypse, as I think of it, occurred about halfway through writing the book. And I did have to rethink certainly the overall tenor, because before Trump was elected, it was much easier to say that these processes that I was advocating were well underway and they had a kind of historical momentum. which I think they still do. But the Trump and the rise of authoritarian populists certainly show that that the Enlightenment project needs more of a push than I might have thought at the time. That it was not already underway with a unstoppable momentum. That there were people standing athwart the Enlightenment, shouting "Stop! Halt!" And I did devote a little more space and time to trying to look forward and ask how likely are these aspects of progress to continue, because a lot of the Trump policies pushed back at them, such as nuclear proliferation, such as global cooperation, such as environmental regulation. And it made me curious as to where this, what seemed like a retrograde ideology, where did it come from? And I then did connect Trumpism to counter-Enlightenment ideologies that had arisen in the 19th century. Now, it may sound a little fanciful to talk about the intellectual roots of Trumpism. It may even sound like an oxymoron. And in fact, one historian of ideas said, forget it, Trump is just pure id. There are no ideas behind it. I think that turned out not to be true, that Trump did have a brain trust of Steve Bannon and Michael Anton and Steve Miller, people who thought of themselves as intellectuals. There's actually a petition in support of Trump in the summer of 2016 signed by 100 professors and intellectuals, and they were absolutely rooted in counter-Enlightenment thinking, not excluding Nietzsche, but a kind of heroism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, the idea that there's no such thing as an individual. There are just everyone is a Frenchman or an Englishman or a German. That international cooperation is a mirage. There's zero-sum competition among nations, which are the same as ethnic groups. So these are ideas. I don't know how many of them Trump discovered through reading, probably zero, but there was a natural harmony between his intuitive way of thinking and this system of ideas. And I think that one way to interpret the revival of authoritarian populism is that it's the latest surge in this counter-Enlightenment mindset.
I'm wondering if I could ask you about Francis Fukuyama, whose book on identity came out last year. It came out after your book. I have noted there's a lot of similar themes in the two books, with Fukuyama tracing everything back to this fundamental idea that humans crave recognition, and that recognition sometimes just can't come through the conventional way that post-Enlightenment societies organize themselves. I don't presume that you've necessarily read Fukuyama's book, but I'm wondering how persuasive you find this idea that there's this atavistic hunger for recognition, which can only be satisfied if you step out of the utilitarian, humanistic way of thinking that ultimately advances the success of whole societies.
Well, yes, and Fukuyama is certainly relevant because his famous article on the end of history announced, many people thought prematurely, that the motives of political organization endorsed by Enlightenment thinkers, namely liberal democracy, had triumphed. And the end of history, in Fukuyama's sense, didn't mean that nothing would ever happen again, but rather that there would be no ideological conflict over the humanly best form of government, that we'd found it, and it was liberal democracy. This was, I think, written off a little prematurely, that the various requiems for liberal democracy don't actually look at the numbers and how popular democracy continues to be, and are retreating a little bit too quickly in the face of developments in Turkey and Hungary, and for that matter, the United States. But one can see that Fukuyama himself had to absolutely complicate his narrative based on what's happening. Now, as a psychological claim, there is much to that, and it's really two claims. One of them is that people have to feel that they matter, as my other half, Rebecca Goldstein, has put it in an article in a forthcoming book, that everyone has some system of values by which they feel that they are significant and worthy of respect. The other half of that is that the way in which people matter has to be in terms of the glory of the group that they belong to, their nation, their religion, their ethnic group. There's and I have not yet read Fukuyama's book. I'm looking forward to. There's reason to believe that there's a fair amount of variability or plasticity in what people attach their identity to. And it needn't only be their nation or ethnic group. It could be their sports team, their city, their state, the brand of camera equipment they use. I think the need to validate your identity by reference to some group of which you're a proud member is very much part of human nature. But what that group is, and how many of those groups there can be, is a matter of context and framing and peer values. And it needn't be that the only way you feel valid is in terms of how many square miles of territory your country occupies.
In your book, you focus a lot on variables that go up and down, that can be measured, that can be graphed. What would you say to the critique that there are certain kinds of threats to humanity that are so existential that they can't be captured with mere graphs and charts? Some people would put global warming in that category, that we're either going to stop global warming or we're not, and if we don't, whole cities are going to be flooded. The same might be true of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, nuclear terrorism, that these are not threats that are amenable to modulation on a gradual up and down basis, and that post-Enlightenment tools thus far haven't given us a definitive way of tackling these scenarios, especially in the case of global warming. The graph that we have for global warming looks like a hockey stick, and we've known about it for decades, but we can't seem to do anything about it.
Well, there's several issues there. Yeah, I do think that that global warming is the most severe threat that we face. We know it's a threat because we're using the tools of the Enlightenment, namely science. Because if you simply walk outside, as the climate deniers say, well, it's pretty cold today, I have to put on a sweater, so therefore global warming is a hoax. We argue against that using the tools of the Enlightenment, namely that our equations and simulations and data sets and models tell us about a future that we can't experience with our five senses, but that we had better believe because our best intellects give us reason to believe it. So you're right that it would be entirely misleading to simply extrapolate from a graph of current temperature or even current well-being that there are non-linearities, including in climate, that many distributions of events have thick tails in the sense that now switching from climate change to, say, the threat of nuclear war, that it is certainly true that because wars are distributed in a distribution that has thick tails, namely that there can be events that are improbable but not astronomically improbable, and they can involve such massive damage that simply multiplying the probability by the damage gives you a misleading impression of the threats that we face. Again, that is a reason, indeed, not to take a graph of war deaths as a direct indicator of the underlying danger. And that's an argument that I made over many pages in an earlier book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, based on analyses by Lewis Fry Richardson in the 1950s. And indeed, I think we do have to worry about it. It is a warning not to use a simple graph as an indicator of the underlying threat. It's certainly not an indictment of Enlightenment thinking. Quite the contrary. It involves these fairly abstruse tools of mathematical analysis and computer modeling to give us a picture of the future and to, even more important, to defy our own intuitions about what will head off the threat, to direct us toward the actions that really will minimize it. And that's especially acute in the case of global warming, where our moral intuitions, I think, lead us astray. I myself, I confess, have participated in campaigns that are utterly worthless, like I posed for a poster showing me unplugging my chargers as my little effort for global warming, fight climate change as part of the Harvard initiative. I did it to be a good sport, but in a way, everyone could unplug their chargers and the planet will still dangerously overheat. That's a case where our intuitions about what the moral thing to do, our numbers tell us, is actually immoral because it will not stave off the threats. We've got to really pay attention to the numbers and say what actually will reduce the threat of catastrophic climate change. And the answer may be very different from what our intuition suggests to us.
The story that you mentioned about unplugging your charger as sort of a PR stunt reminds me of my neighbor who drives across town to get a special kind of detergent that's better for the environment.
Exactly.
But I think a lot of us do this. A lot of it is encouraged by social media, where posturing on behalf of something sometimes gets confused with the real thing. I know that you are somewhat dismissive of the apocalyptic warnings that have been made about social media, but would you say that social media does promote a more superficial hashtag-based approach to confronting some of the existential problems facing our society?
It's a good question. I wouldn't say that it doesn't, although I think the problem is deeper. It's a problem in our moral sense, that our intuitions are driven by the kinds of signals that we tend to use in our social lives to judge people. Who do I want as my ally, a friend? Who do I want in my foxhole? Who do I want to praise? Who do I want to shun? Which is totally incommensurate with a challenge that a problem like global warming faces us. And you might be right that social media makes it worse because there are public acts that can be broadcasted. But the campaign that I volunteered for involved posters plastered around campus. So the dynamic might be worsened by social media, but it's not primarily one of social media. It's really one of an incommensurability between our moral intuitions and the challenge facing us. And it's also very much a question of our moral and political tribalism, that we have certain intuitions or certain convictions based on whether we consider ourselves green, whether we consider ourselves libertarian, and some of the answers that are dictated by our membership in a political tribe are probably wrong in terms of what will actually effectively stave off climate change. Example being acts of conspicuous voluntary conservation, such as unplugging chargers, and versus, say, endorsing nuclear power. Now, it just so happens that partly by way of historical accident, got associated with a kind of right-wing, non-green way of thinking, and is rejected, I argue, prematurely and irrationally by people who, if they are concerned about climate change, really should plug in the numbers and see what's going to get us to zero emissions most quickly.
Well, I'm old enough to remember 3 Mile Island, and my sense was that Western civilization was just getting over fears of nuclear power generation when Fukushima hit. I do try to remind people that it is essentially a zero-emission fuel source.
No, that's quite right. And if you're old enough to remember 3 Mile Island, you may have, I don't know if you ever saw the No Nukes concert. One person I spoke to blamed the Doobie Brothers and Bruce Springsteen and Bonnie Raitt for global warming, because they turned, that benefit concert turned an entire generation away from nuclear power, which, given the fact that people want electricity, more and more people are going to want it, more and more people deserve to have it, it's much better for them to get it from nuclear than from coal. No comparison in terms of the damage to human health, let alone the effect on greenhouse gas emissions.
Doobie Brothers surely were history's greatest monsters. Before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about the very last section of your essay that you wrote for Quillette, which I sense was the closest that you came to maybe anger, although I think you're a very positive person as you project yourself in the way you write. But in the last section of the essay, you analyze the opponents of your book in a way that suggests that they are animated by a kind of sentimentality, and professional hubris. You cite examples from the past where when scientists tried to bridge gaps with the liberal arts, they were sometimes rebuffed on the theory that there's a certain purity and romance and moral stature associated with literature and philosophy that shouldn't be polluted with a scientific form of thinking. And I got the sense that you felt that the reaction to your book was animated by that sort of peevishness. That's not the word you use, it's the word I'm using. But does it make you angry?
Well, I try to. I think, like any author, I experience anger welling up when there are reviews and reactions that I think are unfair, and to the extent that I feel that, that's something that I ought to inhibit and that I try to inhibit. But you might be right in seeing it leaking through. I hope it's more than that. In that, I hope it's also just a diagnosis of where some of the heat comes from on both sides. And in my professional life, I've wondered why I sometimes get attacked by the same people for what seem to be completely different positions. So just to be concrete, some people are up in arms over my argument in Better Angels of Our Nature, amplified in Enlightenment Now, that the world has improved, that violence has declined, that war has declined. So that offended some people. Then I wrote a book on writing, the sense of style, and that seemed to infuriate a number of people, some of the same people, when I suggested that not all rules of prescriptive correct grammar ought to be followed. Some of them are folklore and legends and grandmother's tales, and that a lot of the logic of language comes from usage, from people just doing their best to express themselves, and that a lot of these expert rules are nonsense. So why would those two very different positions tend to rile up the same people? So I probably was peeved both times. I hope it wasn't just my own peeve that led me to ask the question, is there some common denominator? Maybe it's that I'm just maybe I'm a charlatan. Maybe my scholarship is meretricious, and that's the common denominator. Maybe I'm not the one to judge. I think there is something else, and the something else that I think there is there is an enormous amount of resentment from some cultural critics, humanities scholars, literary lions, over what they see as the intrusion of science into their sacred realm. And I did mention the ferocious backlash that C.P. Snow got when he published The Two Cultures in the early 1960s, where F.R. Leavis, one of the literary lions of the day, wrote a reply that was so venomous that the Spectator was nervous about publishing it, and they asked Snow to indemnify him against pressing a libel suit. That's how vicious it was. And around the same time, an American literary critic, Dwight MacDonald, wrote an attack on Webster's Third International Dictionary. Now, why would a dictionary get a literary critic so up in arms? Well, this was the first dictionary that claimed to be based on scientific principles, on computerized data sets of real usage, of theories in linguistics, and he blew a stack. This was just an unacceptable outrage. So, putting aside whatever peevishness I felt, and I hope that wasn't the main motive, it was trying to put my finger on a current of reaction to certain classes of ideas where I think the common denominator is scientists appearing to be like carpetbaggers by the defenders of the traditional territory of the humanities.
And just to be clear, I don't think the peevishness came out in any explicit form. It was just me as an editor, perhaps detecting some undercurrents. To the extent it existed, I thought it was disguised very well.
Okay, glad to hear that.
Thank you so much for appearing on the Quillette podcast and for contributing your essay to Quillette. People can read it at Quillette.com. And your book is called Enlightenment Now. Congratulations on your success and the continued interest in your work.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Quillette podcast. Quillette is where free thought lives. We are an independent grassroots platform for heterodox ideas and fearless commentary. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to Quillette.com and becoming a paid subscriber. This subscription will also give you access to all our articles and early access to Quillette social events.